Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bryan Setser of the Setser Group, and we're hosting our weekly Barriers for Breakfast conversation with innovators across the globe on an array of topics. And a lot of times we do these, I get to bring on a friend, a colleague, someone that I admire in the space. And that's certainly true today with Karen Sherman. We've known each other going back almost a decade now, Karen, I guess, across several fronts. One, your role as president of Aquila and really educating me on what opportunities exist for women in the world and how we need to continue to look at that and grow that enterprise. I think second, I've had a chance to read your book, Brick by Brick, and we're going to work that a little bit in today and talk a little bit about your reactions and reflections over the course of your career regarding women, not only in the workplace, but women culturally and kind of what's at stake for our future. And then we'll also spend some time talking about this notion of Shecession. So, when COVID hit, and this is kind of a lead in to kind of why we're having the conversation, Shecession was taken many ways. There were women sort of leaving the workforce in droves with, COVID and all of the dynamics around it. There were also women advancing and surging forward in a lot of different ways with new businesses and new enterprises. And as a, male who's worked around women in the education space all my career, this sort of misunderstood frontier of how do we encourage succession or Shecession when the odds, the rules, the protocols, the history is not the same for men and women. So I think we're going to get into a lot of topics today and would just love to hear from your perspective, like, why are you in all this work? Why does it matter to you? I know, but I'd really like for our listeners to have an understanding around it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bryan. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. I'll start with the sort of why it matters to me personally and professionally, which is, I have been in the international development business for, as you know, like 30 plus years. I've worked in multiple country contexts, whether it's like the former Soviet Union with women survivors of war and conflict and post-conflict zones, and then really over the last almost 8 years with Aquila. And it's interesting because the two things that I have seen, my global truism, if you will, that make a fundamental difference in the lives of women and girls everywhere is education, of course, but also the ability to earn an income. And I have found that the two go hand in hand. So basically, as an educator myself right now, I do believe that education is insufficient to change the status quo. So the income piece for me is mission critical because while education may give women voice, it's really the income piece that gives women choice. And so from where I'm sitting, when I think of Shecession, and I think you can take it a number of different ways, but my sense of it is women being forced to leave the workforce in large numbers, not because they want to, but because they have to, because of disparities in income or power or workload and all of those factors which are stacked against women, which meant that when push came to shove, they were the ones that had to drop out of the workforce. And so it's one thing if you have to drop out because you want to, you're making the choice to, you want to prioritize different things, you want to start a new business, whatever. But it's quite another if you have to.
A lot to unpack there. And I think one of the things I've learned from you over the years is to look through the lens of what men can do to help. That's always been a theme in our discussion. So I've got a couple of examples, and I would be curious yours and other ways that we can talk about the modern workplace and what women and men leaders can do to make it more effective for women to thrive. But one for me would be maternity leave. Throughout my career, I didn't care what rules that white men above me were setting up. I just led differently. I just said, what do you need? How can I help? We'll work remotely with you, hybrid with you. And if somebody comes in with a policy manual, I'll just say, I apologize for that. I took it a different way. We've already done it. We'll just grandfather them, this kind of deal. Because I knew that providing a sense of security during that time was so important, right? So that's one example of I made a decision as a leader to just do it the other way.
Right.
The second example would be now in working on my team, whether it's contractors, whether it's full-time folks, really being intentional around expressing and being explicit with our policies. And, because we can control that environment, we do it in a way that's with grace. It's sort of humanity first. And how can we work around schedules with childcare, drop off, remote instruction? Let's check in with women and say, what load differences do you have than your husband? And let's figure out our schedule around your best times, not the other way around. So those are two examples that I would use in my own work. But I'm sure as you look across women-led and male-led businesses, there's a bit of a disparity, I'm sure, across the space on how people do it.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, you've kind of voted with your leadership in terms of the way that you lead as somebody who really understands what those power dynamics are like and have chosen to lead differently than perhaps you're finding in general in the workforce. But from where I'm sitting, and again, this is not a US issue, this isn't a global issue, this is something that I have seen in every country context, but certainly here in the United States, is women still do the largest share of unpaid labor. I'm talking about childcare, household responsibilities. And interestingly, even with men home during the pandemic, those statistics didn't really change. So what you had is women carrying that double burden or triple burden, really almost single-handedly, which forced their hand in terms of dropping out of the workforce, but also was crazy making, particularly for women with young children. So you had kind of a perfect storm, if you will, where with COVID, you had schools being closed and childcare opportunities being closed. You had fathers and partners who were not carrying their fair share of responsibilities. And then, as you said, you had structural barriers as well in terms of flexibility, paid leave, differences in compensation, which exacerbated the issue. And then to top it all off, you had a massive uptick in violence against women during the pandemic, which domestic violence and intimate partner violence was way up. Again, all across the country and the globe. And even in like places like Malawi, you had, for example, 15,000 schoolgirls who were stuck at home who got pregnant in the country and will never be going back to school. So, I mean, this is the pandemic really exacerbated a lot of these fundamental disparities that you're seeing with women and girls around the world. And frankly, they'll continue their lives will be changed forever because of that. So, there's a few things that I think that we can do to change this dynamic. And one, certainly, again, this is COVID specific, but, certainly getting child care centers open, kids back in full-time school, freeing up mothers to go back into the workforce. That's one thing. But also being really intentional about fathers doing more of their fair share of the unpaid labor. And I don't know if it's impossible to incentivize them to do so or just guilt them into doing so. But like in my household and my family, as somebody who's had a full-time career and being a writer and somebody who's traveled all over the world, and 3 kids. I couldn't be doing this if my husband didn't carry his fair share or more of some of these domestic responsibilities. And I I wonder a little bit, if I'm being honest, I see my friends in where I live sometimes and sort of wanting their husbands to do more, but not demanding that their husbands do more. And I think, as Hillary Clinton has said, it's time to stop asking for rights and start just demanding those rights. And so I do feel like there's a little bit of that in terms of those shared responsibilities. And then to your point too, there are clearly structural solutions that can be implemented at a leadership level, like you've done with the companies that you've been in, and in terms of flexibility, as you said, maternity and paternity leave, just really creating schedules that are more amenable to families. And then I think there's government incentives as well, structural changes that need to happen at government levels, whether they be state or federal.
Really good stuff, and lots to chew on. I think, your last comment's a good example of where we are. I used the example maternity leave, but didn't say paternity leave. I do, however, believe that if the same was true, I'm thinking of one consultant we have that stays at home during the day, and the only hours that he can be available is sort of 6 to 8 a.m., and he can also be available at night. And we've asked him repeatedly, like, are you sure that's the hours you want to work? And he's like, yes, because I'm full-time father between 8 and 4, and my wife works during that part of the day. So this is a way for me to contract. So that's one piece, right, of certainly
Right.
both ways. But I also think the chief people officers, the DEI officers, this surge we've seen in the last year, one of the first things they should be looking at is mapping talent not only to task, but to time available, right? So you have these women, right, who opted out of the workforce during COVID. There's this huge talent pool sitting there. Are you only bringing them back with one offer of full-time work, or do you have multiple ways that they can re-enter? So when you and I were talking about, preparation for today, we talked a little bit about what did we learn? What did COVID also teach us about ways we can do it better? So totally get exacerbating the gap, and did not know some of those statistics around violence and what we saw not only with women, but also with school children who went home during those situations and didn't have a school place to go. But now coming out of it or coming through it, how do we turn to that first-time mother workforce, if you will, and say, we have a blended option, we have a virtual option. How can we plug you back in and write company policy around that, right? For the DEI officers, the people officers. So curious your thoughts there.
I frankly couldn't agree more. I think, we've found this kind of one size fits all approach to looking at our workforce talent, and particularly when it comes to women, but also men, absolutely. It doesn't work anymore. I mean, if there's anything we've learned, we have to meet people where they are. We need to meet families where they are. And what we ultimately want, what we all want, are productive and happy employees. And people are productive and happy when you meet them where they are. And, in talking to friends and colleagues everywhere, some people are super happy to go back into their offices post-pandemic, particularly young people who've been living in kind of apartments and don't have the same kind of social interactions, and they miss that stimulation of being among colleagues. And there's others who are terrified to go back into the workforce because they've had extra time with children, they've made accommodations, they've managed to sort of work in a different way. And so, I know these conversations are happening right now among employers everywhere. Do we force people to come back to the workforce? If we do, under what terms? What does that look like? Frankly speaking, if we make it too rigid, you might have another dropout of people and women coming back to the workforce. So what you said makes total sense. Why not put it in the hands of our DEI folks, our HR folks, have leadership, understanding that it isn't a one size fits all approach. There's different ways to do that, because if people aren't being productive, you're going to know it. And if people are being productive and engaging with their colleagues, great. I heard, one story on NPR recently saying that the reason they want people, many companies want people to come back into the workforce, is they feel like that kind of creative brainstorming innovation was really missed during the pandemic, and they want to have people in the same space, in the same room, interacting together, which makes a lot of sense. But that doesn't have to be every day. That could be like, we're going to have a brainstorming session every 2 weeks and people are coming in. There's ways to accommodate that get us to the same end.
Yeah, I, have had the pleasure of, jumping into several Aquila efforts over the past year, whether it's DEI work or whether we've been talking about sort of organizational change and adaptation and sort of reimagination, really, of sort of this new era that we're going into, where leaders, I think, they have to be people first. They have to understand the humanity of leadership for a multitude of reasons. I was particularly struck by your comment that you may have a second Shecession if you're going to be rigid. And I think organizations and companies who are too rigid will lose talent to those that aren't. The ones that are flexible will really thrive. So there's women entrepreneurs out there listening, and they're sort of tracking your work across a career and looking at the work you've done at Aquila, the work you've written about in Brick by Brick. And one of the questions I was dying to ask you when we prep for today is, the whole Sheryl Sandberg phenomenon of lean in, and then sort of the aftermath of that book, and kind of, where we find ourselves several years later talking about women as roles, right? There's the alpha woman president who always was the type A and worked 60, 70 hours at the expense of family and everything else. And you can put that same tag, by the way, on any man you choose. People sort of fall into that. And then I think, this, I celebrated a 50th birthday recently, and I was like, have I been doing this right? And really seeking a reflection around my own time and what I expect of others, and how we can be just more healthy, right, in the workforce and with our families and our work. So I'm just curious, some of your key learnings, both at Aquila and in writing the book, about where you end up now after that career. And not anytime soon you're getting out of it, but it's this notion of perspective, right? And sometimes
Sure.
perspective is worth a lot of IQ points for us both, when we can stop back and say, if I had to approach it differently, or as I approach it differently in the next 3 years, here's some truths, here's some things that will absolutely be non-negotiables for me. I'd be curious your thoughts there.
Absolutely. No, it's good. It's interesting, the reference to Sheryl Sandberg, because it's and the whole lean in. And I know there was I think people really supported the idea, and yet, people were saying, well, yeah, particularly other women were saying, it's nice to talk about leaning in if you've got like 3 nannies and this and that, and you have all this money, and it sounds really good. I don't, of course, have those kind of resources, but I, if sort of you take that away, this idea that it's really about your own agency and what you bring to the table, and how you present in the workforce or even in your family. I think that you might get pushback in the workforce, as the aggressive woman, the bitchy woman, the woman who asks for too much. But on the other hand, it's really it's your agency that's at question. And so um, for that, I really liked Lean In, about what that was saying to women. And I think too many women grow up thinking they should be maybe seen but not heard, or they suffer from a sense of their own insufficiency when it comes to participating economically or in sort of high level dialogues. And certainly in Brick by Brick, I've had to wrestle with those kinds of feelings myself. And in the end, where I ended up is that it's about my ownership and my accountability and my agency. Nobody's going to hand me a balanced life. Nobody's going to say, here it is, Karen, take advantage of it.
Right.
And so I, and you can't blame your parents. You actually can't blame your bosses. You can't blame your husband. I mean, not that they're not contributing factors, but in the end, it's really about what you do yourself to carry those things forward. And so that's a big epiphany for me. I would say, as I've gotten farther along in my career, that very convenient to say things are happening to me, things that I don't have control over. And you can imagine there's me with all of my privilege and benefits, and then, all these women who I work with around the world who have so much less, and really really don't have that sense of agency. And so, what we do at Aquila is so much more than education, but helping women to fundamentally understand their rights, their responsibilities, their place in the world, and how to maybe deal with entrenched patriarchy, not in sort of a feminist, this is the way you need to do it, but in something that resonates in their own country context. And I think that's a really important piece. I talk about this in my book, this idea that feminism is not a monolith. It isn't like a one size fits all again, but like, there is country context, there's relevancy, there's what makes sense for who you are and where you are and what you're doing. And so all of those nuances need to be taken into account. And, I know in Rwanda, where I have spent a lot of time working, this whole American brand of feminism doesn't work for them, but it doesn't need to. It
Right.
needs to work for the women in that country.
No, it's great. We're here on our Berries for Breakfast vidcast with Karen Sherman, president of Aquila, author of Brick by Brick, and one of my colleagues and friends in the space that I turn to often to talk about this issue of, women empowerment, women in the workplace, women in economic mobility scenarios, et cetera. And I want to frame this next question in terms of my own daughter and then some of the women that you mentioned who have far less than her and far less than many of us on the globe, and how to cultivate this notion of agency. So in my own daughter's case, she's a second year teacher and she's also working for my company. And I often tell her in the summers, particularly while she's working with me, that like, I want to get you into multiple things, not because I want you to become a project manager or to become, a school principal or to become a owner of a company, but I want you to have these experiences with other people that are your age, older than you, women, men, so that you can decide like where's your purpose, where's your passion around those things. And as you impact more people, you'll also have a set of skills that you can make any choice that you want. And that took me a while to get there, because I think because she was in the family business of education, I made a lot of assumptions that she'll just become a principal or she'll become a superintendent. Sure. And she'll follow the same track that our family has. And I think as you get to looking at people's strengths and where they kind of thrive, I saw her very quickly as a teacher of others, a leader of leaders, but I didn't know exactly how that would manifest. So in her school setting, I'm seeing it more with other teachers and helping them teach and helping them do data and assessment. But when I bring her into the summers, into our work, it's always who can I pair her with, right? Because I want her to see other women leaders or other people than her dad, other perspectives that she can just make choices around. Now, she's fortunate in that she has the privilege, the social capital to say, well, as a result of that, I met this person and now I can go talk to them and I know them personally, et cetera. That's not true around the globe, and it's certainly not true in a lot of our cities in the US. So how do you focus on that? How do you both promote economic mobility through the standard sort of processes, but also have people advocate for themselves, have a presence, have the ability to be interpersonal and network? Talk to me a little bit about what you've seen there over your years at Aquila, but also in your own career and around the world.
Sure. I'll start with an Akilah example because it is really interesting. I mean, for the listeners here to know that the Akilah demographics, the young women who come to Akilah, over half of them come from rural areas. About 78% of them are the first in their families to go to college. A lot of their parents were subsistence farmers. Some of them lost family members in the genocide. So all of that to say that this college education is a really big deal for them, and it's an education to workforce model. So it's 2-year diploma program, which is really the equivalent of associate's degree, linked to some of the high growth sectors in the Rwandan economy: hospitality management and information systems, and small business management, entrepreneurship. And so, but the program is so much more than that. We really focused on what I would call 21st century skills. Um, Initiative, problem solving, communication, social responsibility, public speaking. How do you present? We take these girls who, English obviously is not their first language and it's an English only campus, and they have to get up and they have to present and they have to talk. They're involved in debate clubs and Toastmasters, and they're really getting out there in a completely non-traditional way that you would see, and they're thriving in these environments. And I would say, because Aquila is single sex, you have women, I think, speaking up in a safe space, not feeling afraid or concerned about kind of making a mistake. I think there's a kind of a safe, nurturing environment that we've created for young women to experiment, to innovate, maybe to challenge the status quo that they have in their environments. And so, I didn't grow up with a single sex education mindset, but what I can say is it's worked very effectively in Rwanda to help these young women develop the self-confidence, the agency to be able to not only go out into the workplace and secure jobs, but even to be able to go back and be kind of change makers in their families and communities and societies. And we're seeing that already. I mean, just to some of these statistics really astound me, which is that, you know, 89% of our graduates are paying for healthcare and school fees for other family members. 92% are participating in decisions in their households and their family units. Over 90% are participating in community groups. And maybe those statistics wouldn't be so startling, except if you consider the target demographics that we're talking about. So it's possible with dedication and support to build that level of agency in a country, for example, where you don't have like an Aquila or that kind of contained environment, or to your example, Bryan, where you're able to bring your daughter in and show her sort of different ways of doing things with job shadowing and mentoring and, networking and different types of relationships. Let's taking this example of a woman in Malawi who doesn't have any of those things, showing her some role models, some examples, some things to aspire to, and giving her simple tools that she can use to sort of take a little bit more agency in her own life. And again, those two things that I go back to at the beginning of the conversation, education and income. When women have, even a little bit of education, that makes a big difference in terms of giving them more voice, more agency in their families and communities. But the income piece for women to really say, I want to do things differently. I can do things differently. I used to hear comments all the time like, fathers or uncles or brothers who discounted their daughters or their nieces. But, when she started earning an income, it changed everything. She gained status and respect in the family and community. Her voice mattered all of a sudden. And frankly, it's not too different in this country too, right?
No, that's great. We're here with Karen Sherman, president of Akilah Institute, and also author of Brick by Brick. We're on the Innovators and Barriers for Breakfast conversation line of sort of thinking about this notion of Shecession and thinking about it in sort of three dimensions. How do we encourage, empower, support, promote, get out of the way of women in the workforce? How do we think about recent sort of exodus and resignations and, tapping those talent pools? And then all of a sudden, also thinking about great issues that Karen has raised around what this means for longevity, the ability to look at trauma, the ability to look at things in the space that the average listener may not know about and may not know where women situate. So it's a good segue to what's next. I have spent a year and much of it with you looking at these issues like critical race theory and DEI and you've got all of these things happening at once. And meanwhile, there's that feminist agenda that's not a monolith, as you say, and people are also trying to advocate inside of that or through it or alongside of it. So if you're a DEI officer or you're an HR officer, you've got your work cut out for you. But I think it's equally true that you have it cut out for you as a president. So when you are a CEO or you're the top leader of an organization, when you say that you value diversity or you say that you value equity, what you really need to be intentional about is what's next. We saw a lot of people this last year make statements. We saw a lot of people write the proverbial check that didn't even impact their bottom line. What's next? And I want to share some of our work, but I'm really curious to hear your viewpoint on where do you think we're headed and what do we really need to do if we're going to take some big swings to level the playing field?
No, it's such a great question. A couple of thoughts, really. As an institution that works in Africa that is predominant, they're Africans who are, predominantly working at Aquila. And yet what we found was a lot of our leadership team was white women actually. And so, we have gone through sort of a deep soul searching process here. And because of that, we are really working to turn our organizational management system on its head, and long overdue, quite frankly. What we saw with a lot of other organizations is, just as you said, I don't want to say it's lip service on DEI, but there's intention and there's action, and there's also how far are you willing to go. I also find it so interesting. DEI has become such a buzzword, and when we did this work together, sort of breaking them out. What do you mean by diversity? What do you mean by equity? What do you mean by inclusion? They're not the same thing. They're not the same thing at all. And so really taking sort of a honed lens to DEI as not being necessarily a catch-all, but sort of an intention and action around diversity and what that means. It could be diversity in hiring. It could be diversity in terms of points of views that get shared. What do we mean by equity? Equity could mean in terms of male, female from an Aquila standpoint, but it could mean other things to other institutions. And inclusion, again, means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So taking some time to unpack and define, I think, is really important. So back to what we did, which is ended up completely dismantling our global leadership structure and putting in place a practice of holacracy, which is really aligned more on the self-management front. And as you know, Bryan, you've been part of some of those discussions, but holacracy is super interesting, which is this idea that management is sort of very parental by its very structure and top down, and not necessarily conducive to moving forward with diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'm using the totality of it right now as I'm talking about it, but in all of its parts. And so this idea that you have these self-managing circles and some centralization where you get support to these circles to be able to execute as they see fit and really feel empowered to lead according to their talents and skills, and also as they're sensing and responding to opportunities in the marketplace. I mean, I really like that. Over the course of my 30-year career, I've been a manager, I have been a top leader, and right now I don't manage anybody, and it's kind of a beautiful thing. I engage with my colleagues on a variety of different levels, colleagues, frankly, that I haven't worked with all the time at Aquila, but do now through holacracy. And so I'm not saying that that is the answer to other institutions, but I think taking a much bigger, deeper swath at really changing some of those power dynamics that really exist fundamentally within so many companies and institutions. And there's also a lot that I think we can do to, better prepare women for the future as well. And we can talk a little bit about that as we move on.
No, it's great. I've been struck in the past year with our work at Winston-Salem State. We took several courses at 228 Accelerator, USF. My wife is deep in the work at REI and RTI, and I'm looking at all of it, and I'm struck by a few things. One is, once you get past the education agenda, the awareness, sort of the knowledge base, then how do you name what you apply, right? And so if it's things like hiring practices, if it is things like the amount of contracts you award to women-owned businesses, I mean, you can take the metrics different ways, but the big issue to me has been this cultural shift in the organizations that I'm looking in on that's like, no, we're super explicit about the type of leadership we want. We're super explicit about the things we will not throw away, but just do better.
Right.
And then we are super explicit about, we're going to have Shecession programs. We're going to staff differently, look at teams differently, look at contractors differently. And so it'll be interesting over the next few years how all of that plays out, and which organizations are recognized not just as being more humane because of the hours and sort of combating these Shecession gaps that women often face,
Yeah.
but actually where they put their money, where they invest in, where they value, and then if they're ever audited, looking back at that moment and saying that was the moment that they really shifted gears. One small example is we did some work recently at Winston-Salem State where I went up and visited UPenn and Catalyst, and they were telling me about they changed a line in their pitch competitions that every startup founder had to demonstrate in their pitch how they were addressing equity. And it was just that phrase.
Mm-hmm.
But once you put it in there, now the team has to go back and say, what's equity, right? And I mean that for some of them, it was a first experience. And then for others, it was kind of like, man, we've got to differentiate ourselves, right? So if we want these resources, well, when I heard that story, I was like, that ought to be the same story that any C-suite member is telling their team member. You want us to back your project? How does it address equity? And if you can't demonstrate that, thank you for working here and you can support us, but we're not going to invest in your part of the division or your part of the group because you're not there yet, right?
Absolutely.
And so I'm intrigued by this holacracy piece with that, because you're right. The ability to watch those circles sort of manifest and attract other people, resources, initiatives, versus maybe this circle over here that's challenged a little bit and comes to either look in that circle, cross-pollinate it, have a leader kind of say, let me pair you with this leader of the other circle because you two really need to chat, without being so dogmatic. And I would say this, if we were at a conference or at a bar, I am a product of white supremacy urgency. Like, I was taught it.
Sure.
It's in my DNA. It's one of those trap doors that I always have to guard against and kind of say, is this Bryan's timeline, or is this somebody else's, or have I taken the time to notice what we're really trying to do here? So even sometimes spending time with those leaders who have had a lot of biases or had a lot of things that they've done and saying, we're going to have to reculture you a little bit because we're making this shift to new types of models. So
yeah,
really compelled by all of that. And maybe we'll get to a point here at the end of our call just to have some last words on that thread, because I think it's going to take all of us to reflect, regardless of our experiences. In many ways, we're a learner again. We need to be curiosity bound again.
That's right. And I've been taking some courses on this question of inherent bias. That, as you said, you come in. I was raised that way too. Top down. I'm going to get it done. I'm very results oriented, and didn't really think about it from a white supremacy culture standpoint. I just thought, I'm an effective leader. Look at me, right? But actually, really unpacking that on so many different levels. But as you said, and I really agree with this level of self-awareness, this willingness to do the self-examination, this willingness to change things up, to add the equity line, what does it mean? I mean, challenging those long-held assumptions and biases, it's got to start there. Or really, it's more of the same.
Mm-hmm. No doubt. Well, we want to thank Karen for her time today on our Berries for Breakfast vidcast. We've covered an array of topics. We're going to announce to the audience on our YouTube live that they'll have an opportunity to engage with Karen, myself, and members of both of our teams. We certainly will follow on in the resources on the premier event with the work that Akilah is doing, the work that Karen has authored brick by brick, and how that can really help us all understand, along with the video today, sort of this notion of Shecession and where we're headed. So, Karen, I know we're going to stay for the after party for a few minutes, but thank you for being on with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome.